There are fragments in the geological record that seem to whisper of a world older than the one we know, a world shaped long before the last ice age sealed the northern hemisphere under a monumental shroud of ice. Archaeologists speak of submerged coastlines now lying more than 100 meters beneath the sea, remnants of ancient river valleys and shore settlements erased when the Great Melt began around 12,000 years ago. In scattered places, from the mysterious precision-cut stones at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dating back to around 9600 BCE, to the sunken structures off the coast of Doggerland in the North Sea, once a vast land bridge connecting Britain to Europe. There lingers a quiet suggestion that human hands might have shaped stories far older than our textbooks allow. Yet each clue is incomplete, as if some ancient library burned long before our earliest written myths appeared. Why do the earliest civilizations, from Sumer to Egypt, begin abruptly with sophistication that seems to lack a visible developmental path? What memories were carried through the Ice Age only to disappear as the world warmed, shorelines retreated, and entire cultures were swallowed by rising oceans? And what if the end of the Ice Age, so often celebrated as the dawn of agriculture and settlement, was also the moment humanity lost something, knowledge, technologies, or beliefs, too fragile to survive the flood? These questions linger like distant echoes, asking whether our story is truly linear, or if it once rose and fell with the tides of forgotten eras. Welcome to the Cryptic Realm channel. If the past concealed more than it revealed, what else waits beneath the surface, waiting for us to remember? The shoreline of the ancient world looked nothing like the neat blue borders we see on modern maps, and perhaps that is where the first quiet contradiction begins. When sea levels stood more than 100 meters lower, vast plains stretched where waves now move in restless silence. The great continental shelves, today hidden beneath layers of silt and salt water, were once fertile hunting grounds, river deltas, and gathering places where early humans watched the slow rhythms of the sky. Yet when archaeologists dredge fragments of worked flint from the submerged banks of what was once Doggerland, or when divers trace the faint outlines of stone pavements off the coast of India near the Gulf of Kampat, the narrative feels strangely incomplete. Why, if people lived there for millennia, is so little left behind? Is it simply erosion, or is it the result of something more profound, a disruption so total that it scattered memory itself? The landscapes of the late Pleistocene offered a world both harsher and more generous than the one we now inhabit. Colossal ice sheets pressed down across Eurasia and North America, redirecting winds, reshaping rivers, and carving valleys that still guide our geography. But south of the ice, where the climate was cooler, calmer, and surprisingly stable, humans did more than survive. They thrived in pockets of productivity. The Levantine corridor, lush with seasonal abundance, the once green Sahara, marked by ancient lakes and engravings of animals long gone, the coasts of Southeast Asia, now hidden beneath the rising post-glacial seas. These were not forgotten wastelands of primitive wanderers, but landscapes where people observed cycles, mapped the stars, and left behind symbols whose meaning hovers just out of reach. In caves like Chauvet and El Castillo, the artwork pulses with a sophistication that feels older than our accepted timeline for cultural emergence. The pigments, carefully prepared, the strokes intentional and skilled, the motifs repeating across continents as if echoing shared memories. And when researchers find geometric patterns carved into ochre blocks at sites like Blombos in South Africa, dated more than 70,000 years old, the question deepens. How did symbolic thinking appear so suddenly, already mature, without a clear evolutionary gradient? Was this simply the natural flowering of the human mind, or the remnant of traditions carried forward from an earlier, unseen stage of collective development? As the Ice Age tightened its grip, these cultures adapted with a resilience that suggests more than mere instinct. They engineered stone tools with remarkable consistency across thousands of kilometers. They practiced early forms of navigation to reach islands requiring crossings of open water, as seen in the settlement of Australia more than 60,000 years ago. They built shelters, managed fire deliberately, and may have engaged in rituals tied to celestial events, a hypothesis strengthened by alignments found at sites like Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, where stone circles from the pre-agricultural era seem to track the movement of stars. But if these people were already capable of such complexity, why do their traditions feel so abruptly severed at the dawn of the Holocene? Some researchers argue that nothing was lost, that humanity simply continued evolving into the civilizations we recognize. Yet sea rise did not occur gently. It happened in pulses, episodes like Meltwater Pulse 1A, a dramatic surge of ocean levels around 14,600 years ago. Entire coastlines vanished in centuries, not millennia. Forests drowned. River mouths swallowed. Settlements, if they existed, disappeared without hope of preservation. Even oral memory, that fragile thread binding one generation to the next, could fracture in the face of such upheaval. If there had been centers of knowledge along these ancient shores, communities that tracked seasons, mapped tides, or preserved lore about the sky, how easily might they have been erased? One might wonder whether the survivors carried fragments of those traditions inland, shaping the mythologies that later civilizations recorded in incomplete form. Flood narratives appear from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica, not as distant exaggerations, but as cultural memories echoing real and catastrophic change. Could these stories be distorted reflections of events witnessed during the Ice Age's violent end? Or do they hint at something more? A recognition that the world once looked different, governed by forces and patterns now forgotten? The more evidence we uncover, scattered tools, submerged structures, enigmatic symbols, the more elusive the full picture becomes. Each discovery promises clarity, but instead opens new corridors of doubt, suggesting that we stand at the edge of a vast archive whose pages have been torn away by time, water, and silence. It is difficult not to ask what kinds of communities once flourished on those vanished plains, what knowledge they built their lives upon, and how much of that knowledge dissolved when the ice receded. And as these questions deepen, another begins to form in the quiet spaces between them. If so much of humanity's early story lies beneath the sea or buried under layers of sediment, how much of what we call the beginning is merely the visible remnant of something much older, something we have yet to truly face? There is a moment, barely visible in the archaeological record, when the world seems to inhale before shifting into a different rhythm. The warming had begun, slowly at first, and with it the ice sheets softened around their edges. Rivers long locked beneath frozen corridors swelled and carved new paths across the continents. Yet this transition, so often described in textbooks as a gentle prelude to the Holocene, hides a more profound tension. For while the climate changed, human ingenuity responded with a sophistication that does not feel entirely new. At sites like Ohalo II in the Jordan Valley, dating to nearly 23,000 years ago, people built brush huts arranged with surprising order, processed grains long before agriculture, and crafted tools with delicate precision. These were not temporary encampments, but semi-permanent settlements, hinting that the seeds of societal structure had already taken root long before the Neolithic dawn. The presence of ground stone tools, objects that require patience, planning, and a familiarity with materials, suggests a lineage of knowledge stretching back farther than we can comfortably trace. If such practices existed before the coldest phase of the Ice Age, then what kinds of traditions might have been lost in the fluctuating centuries that followed? Archaeologists often speak of cultural bottlenecks, moments when population declines or environmental stress compress diversity. But what if the bottleneck we imagine was less about survival and more about memory? If communities once shared ideas across vast stretches of the ancient world, the rising chaos of meltwater floods and climatic instability could have fractured those networks beyond repair. In the caves of Europe, where the cold drove people inward, evidence points toward a symbolic system that persisted despite the harsh climate. Carvings of animals, abstract shapes, and human-like forms appear not as sporadic doodles, but as part of a visual language maintained through generations. Some researchers have noted that recurring motifs, spirals, lattices, zigzags, mirror the neurovisual patterns produced in altered states of consciousness, suggesting that rituals and beliefs may have been deeply embedded within early communities. Yet, if such traditions were widespread, why do they feel so disconnected from the symbolic systems of later civilizations? Did these early expressions serve a purpose we no longer understand, or were they part of a cultural framework that dissolved in the turbulence at the Ice Age's end? Elsewhere, in regions now submerged beneath the Pacific and Indian Oceans, the archaeological silence is deafening. The migration routes that carried humans across Southeast Asia and toward Australia likely followed coastlines that no longer exist. Early seafarers would have relied on knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal patterns, skills implying a level of observation and transmission that rarely appears in mainstream narratives. The discovery of stone tools on islands like Flores, where hominins survived for millennia, hints at interaction between human groups whose stories have vanished beneath geological upheaval. Yet the lack of direct evidence leaves us suspended in uncertainty, caught between possibility and absence. Some point to genetic studies indicating ancient population expansions and contractions, movements echoing the dramatic environmental changes unfolding across the globe. These shifts likely carried with them the remnants of older traditions, songs, myths, practical skills, fragments preserved in the collective consciousness of migrating groups. But as these communities adapted to new landscapes, how much of their inherited knowledge remained relevant? And how much was quietly abandoned when familiar coastlines disappeared beneath rising seas, turning sacred sites into unreachable ghosts beneath the waves? The end of the Pleistocene did not arrive as a single, decisive moment. it unfolded in waves, each one reshaping the world slightly more than the last. Forests spread into former tundras. Animals migrated, some vanishing forever. Human communities were forced to reinvent themselves, often in rapid succession. In this period of profound transition, we can almost sense the dissolution of something older. Networks of understanding that once bridged landscapes now fractured by water and time. If these pre-Ice Age cultures possessed knowledge systems shaped over tens of thousands of years, how easily might they have been scattered when their world fractured? And so a quiet thought emerges, uncomfortably persistent. If we stand today on the residue of only what managed to survive the melt, then what vast expanse of human thought lies unseen beneath the threshold of recorded history? Along the edges of continents, where the sea now washes over forgotten topographies, lies a silence that feels almost intentional, an absence shaped not merely by time, but by the violence of a world rearranging itself. As the Ice Age waned, the oceans surged forward in uneven pulses, swallowing valleys, forested plains, and river mouths that had served as the arteries of early human life. And yet, within this growing void, tantalizing traces remain, small enough to be overlooked, persistent enough to disturb the accepted narrative. Off the coast of Japan, the underwater terraces near Yonaguni present geometric formations, steps, platforms, straight angles, that some argue were once shaped by human hands. While mainstream geology attributes them to natural fracturing of sandstone, divers and researchers have pointed to wear patterns and alignments that echo deliberate design. If these structures were indeed crafted during a time of lower sea levels, what kind of coastal communities might have built them, and what traditions vanished when the waters rose? The shifting climate forced migrations that followed a paradoxical logic. People moved not away from danger, but toward regions that held seasonal predictability. In the Levant, groups known from the Natufian culture began settling into semi-sedentary lifestyles around 15,000 years ago. They harvested wild cereals, carved bone tools with exquisite care, and buried their dead with ornaments made from shells obtained hundreds of kilometers away. Such evidence suggests networks of exchange and communication that stretched far beyond the boundaries of any single valley. But the sophistication of these practices feels disconnected from earlier eras, unless we consider the possibility that these traditions were not inventions, but survivals. Perhaps the Natufians were inheritors of older coastal peoples whose homes now lie beneath the Mediterranean, their stories muted by the weight of the sea. Meanwhile, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, evidence of early forest management and controlled burns dates back nearly 45,000 years. Such environmental manipulation reveals a mindset capable of long-term planning, one that challenges the notion of early humans as passive observers of their world. If these methods had spread along the ancient coasts of Southeast Asia, they too might have contributed to localized systems of knowledge, traditions that guided land use, ritual cycles, and communal practices. Yet none of this appears in the neat progression usually presented in modern histories, as if the complexity of the ancient world must always be an exception rather than a rule. Even in Europe, where glacier melt carved deep corridors into the landscape, cultural threads show signs of continuity abruptly interrupted. The Magdalenian people, known for their detailed cave art and sophisticated bone tools, flourished before fading from the archaeological record around 12,000 years ago. Their disappearance coincides uncannily with the climatic fluctuations leading into the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions. Whether this event caused displacement, societal restructuring, or the loss of cultural memory remains uncertain. Yet the abruptness of the Magdalenian decline leaves a lingering question. Did climatic turmoil erase traditions that had persisted for thousands of years? Or did those traditions survive in altered forms among groups who migrated to new lands? As coastlines retreated inland, groups were forced into competition for shrinking ecological niches. Forests replaced plains, altering hunting patterns. Rivers shifted, changing migration routes, and once familiar territories became unrecognizable. In this turmoil, knowledge that had depended on stable landscapes, navigation points, seasonal markers, sacred sites, could have unraveled. If early humans possessed a deep understanding of tidal cycles, star movements, or resource mapping tied to specific geographic features, the erasure of those features might have severed the continuity of their lore. And in the absence of written records, even a brief interruption in transmission could create cultural amnesia lasting thousands of years. Some traditions, however, may have endured in symbolic form. The widespread myths of a great flood, found in cultures from Mesopotamia to the Pacific Islands, could be echoes of real events witnessed during the rapid sea level rise. But myths alone cannot reconstruct the full texture of those lost worlds. What foods they cultivated, what rituals they practiced, what alliances or conflicts shaped their societies. Archaeology, limited to what survives in stone or bone, cannot easily recover the intangible. Melodies, oral histories, cosmologies woven into daily life. And when entire regions sink beneath the ocean, even the durable materials vanish into darkness. It leaves one wondering whether the true scale of humanity's early accomplishments has been obscured not by a lack of capacity, but by the sheer violence of geological change. If civilization is defined not by monumental architecture, but by systems of shared meaning, cooperative practice, and enduring memory, then perhaps the roots of civilization stretch far deeper than the ruins we can still touch. Perhaps what we recognize as the beginning is only the re-emergence of something that had been thriving, and then swept away, long before the Holocene dawn. And in this quiet uncertainty, another thought takes shape. If the sea could erase so much, what remnants of the pre-Ice Age world might still lie hidden in depths, yet unexplored, waiting to challenge everything we believe about the origins of human complexity? Across the vast stretches of the ancient world, where climates shifted and coastlines redrew themselves with relentless indifference, human groups adapted in ways both visible and obscured. Yet within this mosaic of survival, there are moments when the archaeological record seems to hint at something more than adaptation, something resembling continuity, as though threads of an earlier worldview persisted despite the upheaval of the Ice Age's final centuries. One such thread emerges in the study of megalithic traditions, not the grand monuments of later millennia, but their subtle precursors, upright stones arranged with care, aligned with celestial markers, found in regions as distant as Africa and Siberia. These early configurations suggest an attentiveness to the cycles of the sky that predates agriculture, domestication, and the settled life we usually associate with astronomical observation. If people tracked the heavens before they sowed fields, what purpose did those markers serve in their world? The discovery of stone alignments at sites like the Grotte du Renne in France, or the enigmatic T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe, carved nearly 12,000 years ago at the very edge of the Ice Age's retreat, raises questions about the depth of symbolic tradition in pre-agricultural societies. While Göbekli Tepe is often celebrated as a sudden leap in ritual architecture, its sophistication suggests it did not arise from nothing. The carving techniques, the consistent iconography, the communal effort required to raise pillars weighing several tons, all of it implies a lineage of craftsmanship and symbolic meaning carried forward from earlier generations. These builders were not inexperienced experimenters. They were inheritors of practices refined over time. Yet the world that shaped those traditions is mostly gone, erased by shifting climates and melting ice. In the dry highlands of Ethiopia, obsidian tools dating back more than 40,000 years reveal evidence of long-distance exchange networks. Obsidian, with its glass-like edge, was prized for both utility and symbolic value, suggesting that communities recognized the material not merely for its sharpness, but perhaps for its luminous, almost otherworldly appearance. The presence of obsidian sourced from distant quarries indicates that people traveled or traded across great distances, carrying with them objects imbued with meaning. Such networks, existing long before the rise of agriculture, challenge the notion that mobility precludes complexity. They hint at a world where knowledge about resources, routes, rituals, circulated across landscapes now fragmented by floods and deserts. In the now dry Sahara, rock engravings depict giraffes, cattle, and ritual scenes from a time when the region was a vast green expanse, dotted with lakes and teeming with wildlife. Some images show figures wearing elaborate adornments, holding objects that might be staffs, instruments, or ceremonial tools. The artists carved with confidence, using techniques that required fine control and repeated practice. If such imagery reflects more than daily life, if it encodes myths, social roles, or cosmological beliefs, then this desert, long assumed to be lifeless in antiquity, may once have been a center of cultural expression. And if the Sahara could hide such a past, what of the submerged lands along the Mediterranean coast or the drowned plains of Southeast Asia? Meanwhile, genetic studies hint at population structures more intricate than previously imagined. Ancient DNA extracted from remains across Europe and Asia shows waves of migration that intersected and overlapped, suggesting that cultural exchange occurred in fits and starts, shaped by climate and opportunity. The mixing of lineages carries echoes of interactions, alliances, marriages, apprenticeships that seldom leave behind physical traces. If traditions, skills, and stories moved with these populations, then the cultural landscape of the pre-Ice Age world might have been far richer than the sparse archaeological record implies. Yet for all these hints, the story remains fragmented. Sites that might have held the key to understanding's earliest symbolic traditions lie beneath layers of ocean sediment. Coastal plains where early humans likely gathered, built shelters, and observed the heavens vanished as the ice melted. Even inland, erosion and sedimentation have buried traces of ancient occupation beneath dozens of meters of soil. The record is patchy not because the past was simple, but because its remnants were scattered by forces indifferent to human memory. What becomes unsettling is the possibility that the map of human history we follow today shows only the peaks, not the valleys, only the remnants that managed to survive by accident rather than intention. If the earliest expressions of symbolic thought, shared knowledge, and communal identity were rooted in landscapes now unrecognizable, then the origins of culture might lie not in the dawn of farming, but in eras long overshadowed by ice and sea. And as this realization settles, another quiet wonder rises. If the patterns we glimpse today are merely the outlines of something older, how much of humanity's earliest story still lies hidden, waiting for a moment when the world shifts once again to reveal what was taken by time? Across the deepening shadows of prehistory, there are places where the earth seems to hold its breath, as if reluctant to reveal what once unfolded upon its surface. Among these, the ancient river systems that spiderwebbed across Eurasia during the late Pleistocene offer some of the most evocative clues. Long before agriculture reshaped the land, these rivers acted as highways, conduits for migration, trade, and the slow drift of ideas. Yet, as the climate shifted and glaciers retreated, many of these waterways transformed beyond recognition. Rivers that once flowed steadily toward inland basins were diverted, dammed by meltwater, or swallowed by rising seas. Entire cultural landscapes disappeared beneath new courses of water, leaving behind only isolated traces that feel more like echoes than evidence. On the plains north of the Black Sea, archaeologists have uncovered remnants of settlements predating the region's later Neolithic cultures. Hearths, stone tools, and scattered bones hint at semi-sedentary groups who followed migratory herds yet returned seasonally to the same favored sites. Some discoveries suggest the presence of structures with organized interior spaces, layouts that imply communal planning rather than haphazard construction. These early communities may have been the carriers of traditions that extended across the Eurasian steppe. Yet the sudden inundation associated with the post-glacial flooding of the Black Sea region may have fractured their continuity. Whether the dramatic rise occurred slowly or catastrophically remains debated, but either scenario carries the same consequence: a reshaping of memory, a dispersal of knowledge, and the severing of ties that once bound distant groups together. Farther east in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, discoveries attributed to both early Homo sapiens and the enigmatic Denisovans point to cultural interactions that defy simplistic narratives. Jewelry crafted from polished bone, pendants made from animal teeth, and tools of remarkable refinement have been found layered in sediments more than 40,000 years old. Some artifacts show signs of complex manufacturing techniques: grooves carved for stringing ornaments, symmetrical shaping achieved through controlled pressure flaking. These objects speak to identities, social roles, and aesthetic traditions that must have taken generations to develop. Yet such sophistication appears in pockets, isolated by time and geography, suggesting that much of the connective tissue between these cultures may have vanished, carried away by climatic instability or by the natural amnesia imposed by shifting landscapes. In eastern Turkey, not far from the later megalithic wonders of Göbekli Tepe, lies the Karaka Dağ region, often cited as a cradle of early domestication. Genetic studies of wheat show that some of the earliest strains arose here, But what is rarely emphasized is that the surrounding terrain was once vastly different. Before the Ice Age ended, the plateaus may have supported diverse plant communities, offering opportunities for gathering, experimentation, and perhaps even the proto-domestication of cereals. If human groups in this region already understood seasonal patterns and plant cycles, then the transition to agriculture may not have been a sudden innovation, but the culmination of knowledge stretching back into deeper time. The loss of early coastal settlements and the collapse of ecological niches could have obscured the true origins of these practices, leaving us with only the late-stage remnants preserved by chance. The melting of the ice brought both opportunity and chaos. Forests expanded into former tundra, creating environments rich in game and plant life. But with this transformation came the disappearance of open plains that had sustained earlier cultures. Communities accustomed to vast, unobstructed landscapes may have struggled to adapt to the dense woodlands that replaced them. Hunting techniques changed, migration routes shifted, and the knowledge tied to tracking herds across open terrain may have faded within a single generation. If people once relied on a shared cosmology to navigate their world, reading the horizon, the movement of stars, the behavior of animals, then the loss of that physical context might have fragmented their worldview, leaving behind symbolic remnants whose meanings drifted over time. Some scholars propose that the dramatic climate swings of the Younger Dryas period, an abrupt cooling event around 1200 years ago, acted as a cultural filter, preserving only those practices suited to the new conditions. If so, then the knowledge systems that had flourished during the stable millennia before the Ice Age's end may have been quietly extinguished. Rituals tied to vanished landscapes, technologies suited to extinct megafauna, and navigational traditions based on lost coastlines would have become obsolete. And yet, traces of those forgotten worlds may linger in the myths of later societies. Stories of golden ages, of ancient peoples who knew secrets of the land, of cycles disrupted by celestial or earthly events. What remains unsettling is the realization that we may be reconstructing the past from fragments that survived because they were exceptional, not because they were representative. If the ordinary, everyday expressions of ancient culture have vanished, leaving only the rare and resilient, how skewed might our understanding be? How much richer, more complex, more interconnected might the world have been before the ice began to melt? And as these thoughts gather, one more uncertainty rises. If rivers, plains, and coastlines once nurtured the earliest expressions of human continuity, what forgotten pathways lie beneath the sediments, waiting for the right discovery to shift our understanding once again? In the vast silence that stretches across the submerged continental shelves, there lingers the faint impression of worlds we can no longer touch. Worlds whose outlines must be reconstructed from the smallest of remnants, like trying to recall a forgotten dream from a fragment of sound or shadow. Among the most compelling of these lost realms are the prehistoric coastal corridors that once linked continents in ways modern geography obscures. During the Ice Age, the coastline of East Asia extended hundreds of kilometers farther than today, forming a continuous stretch of land that connected the islands of what is now Indonesia to the Asian mainland. These shores, rich in resources and sheltered from the harshest glacial winds, would have drawn human groups into dense networks of interaction. Yet almost the entirety of this landscape now lies beneath the sea, hidden under layers of silt carried by millennia of shifting currents. In these drowned worlds, archaeologists catch only momentary glimpses of ancient life. A cluster of stone tools preserved in unusually stable sediments, or the imprint of hearths buried deep within submerged caves. The caves of Borneo, for instance, hold older layers of human presence dating back tens of thousands of years, including the oldest known figural cave painting, a depiction of a wild animal more than 40,000 years old. The sophistication of this image hints at a tradition of artistic expression that must have developed long before the cave itself became a canvas. Yet where those traditions originated, or how they spread across the vast archipelago, remains obscured. If the surrounding coastal lands once supported thriving communities, what stories did those early artists grow up hearing? What rituals shaped their sense of time, place, and meaning? South of these islands, the now submerged plains between Australia and New Guinea once formed the continent of Sahul, a region settled by humans as early as 65,000 years ago. Reaching Sahul required sea crossings that challenge the assumption of early humans as rudimentary navigators. The presence of settled populations suggests not only seafaring skill, but also social cooperation. Boats built, routes memorized, timing coordinated. It is difficult to imagine such feats arising spontaneously. They point instead to a lineage of maritime knowledge that likely extended across the exposed continental shelves of Southeast Asia. But as sea levels rose, these plains disappeared, taking with them the harbors, camps, and paths that might have preserved direct evidence of early navigation. What we find instead are isolated artifacts, shell beads, stone tools, remnants of ochre, leaving us to wonder whether these were the last shadows of a maritime culture far more ancient than we assume. Even inland, the vestiges of pre-Ice Age traditions appear only as faint outlines. In the limestone towers of southern China, tools and fossil remains suggest that humans inhabited the region for tens of thousands of years. Yet stylistic similarities between tool types hint at long-term cultural continuity that is difficult to trace directly. If these communities maintained stable lifeways over millennia, how much of their worldview shifted when rising seas forced migrations inland? Did they carry their cosmologies with them, reshaping them in new environments? Or did those cosmologies fracture when the landscapes they anchored themselves to vanished? Without written language, such transitions leave only subtle marks, shifts in tool design, changes in burial practices, differences in resource use. Yet beneath these practical adaptations might lie deeper conceptual changes that archaeology cannot easily detect. Far to the north, along the exposed plains that once stretched between Siberia and Alaska, the region known as Beringia, human groups lived in relative isolation for thousands of years. Genetic research suggests that these populations experienced long periods of stability, developing traditions that may not have survived as they spread into the Americas. The tundra steppe of Beringia supported megafauna and plant species unlike those found further south, and the human lifeways adapted to that environment likely vanished as climates warmed and ecological niches collapsed. If these early communities possessed a cohesive cultural identity, what became of it when they dispersed into unfamiliar territories? Did fragments of their beliefs survive in the mythologies of later indigenous peoples? Or were they lost with the last hunters who remembered the old landscapes? The more we examine the scattered evidence, the more apparent it becomes that the end of the Ice Age was not merely the warming of a planet, but the dissolution of entire ecosystems that had supported human culture for tens of millennia. When coastlines drowned, when plains turned to forest, when migratory routes collapsed, knowledge tied to those environments would have evaporated. Not because humans forgot, but because the context in which that knowledge had meaning no longer existed. This realization brings with it an unease that grows with every submerged map and every fragment retrieved from the sea floor. If much of humanity's early cultural development unfolded along coastlines that no longer exist, then are we basing our idea of the beginning of civilization on what happened to survive rather than what actually occurred? And if that is the case, how much of the human story remains hidden beneath the quiet weight of the oceans, waiting for the rare convergence of chance and discovery to reveal even a single new thread? Across the thresholds where land once stretched into the sea, there lingers a deeper mystery, one that emerges not from monumental ruins or striking artifacts, but from the subtle interplay between human memory and environmental change. As the Ice Age drew nearer to its end, groups across Africa, Eurasia, and Oceania faced a world in transition. Yet rather than collapsing under the burden of climatic turmoil, many of these communities showed signs of innovation, adaptation, and symbolic expression that seem almost too cohesive to be isolated developments. Their practices, burial customs, artistic motifs, technological refinements, echo across continents in ways that suggest shared principles, even when direct contact between groups seems improbable. It raises a quiet question. Did these traditions spring forth independently, or were they the remnants of older, far-reaching networks that had flourished during long stretches of stability before the final melt? On the vast expanse of what is now the Red Sea, for example, lies a corridor that once linked northeast Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. During glacial periods, sea levels dropped, exposing land bridges and shallow channels that early humans could cross with relative ease. Archaeologists studying the Arabian interior have uncovered stone tools nearly identical to those found in eastern Africa. Sharp points made with the levallois technique, a sophisticated method requiring careful removal of flakes from prepared stone cores. These similarities suggest more than the simple spread of technology. They imply continuity of teaching, apprenticeship, and shared understanding across generations. But as the Red Sea filled and coastlines drowned, the evidence of habitation along these ancient corridors vanished beneath waves that erased not only physical structures, but also the environmental context that shaped these cultural convergences. What stories might have been preserved on those vanished shores, stories of migration, kinship, or cosmology, that now survive only as faint shadows in scattered lithic trails? The Arabian Peninsula itself, often depicted as barren in prehistoric times, was once a mosaic of lakes and grasslands. Excavations at sites like Jubba and Al-Wusta reveal footprints, tools, and animal remains that paint a picture of thriving communities navigating lush wetlands. These groups likely monitored seasonal changes, tracked herds, and perhaps even practiced early water management techniques. Yet their presence is episodic, appearing and disappearing in the archaeological record as climates fluctuated. Every time the rains retreated and the desert reclaimed the land, people moved on, carrying with them memories of green landscapes that no longer existed. If traditions linked to these vanished environments were passed down, how transformed must they have been by the time later cultures encountered them? Perhaps what we read today as mythic imagery, gardens of abundance lost to desolation, are distant recollections of real ecological shifts witnessed by ancestors whose world was repeatedly remade. Farther west, along the Atlantic coast of Africa, shell middens, fish hooks, and harpoon points reveal a maritime culture that thrived during periods of lower sea level. These early coastal foragers adapted to tidal rhythms, understood seasonal migrations of fish, and may have built simple watercraft. Their presence challenges the idea that seafaring began only in the late prehistoric world. Yet the vast majority of their settlements now lie hidden underwater, lost to the encroaching ocean. The tools recovered from inland sites offer only partial views, suggesting competence, not context. Without the coastal settlements themselves, the larger meaning of their maritime traditions remains elusive. What ceremonies honored the sea? What taboos governed the harvest of its resources? How did their cosmology merge with the cycles of tides and moon? The answers likely rest beneath layers of sand and silt, sealed away by waters that reclaimed the very lifelines of their existence. In Europe, too, fragments of cultural continuity appear and then dissolve. The Gravettian hunters of Central Europe, known for their delicate Venus figurines, tailored clothing, and sophisticated hunting strategies, eventually gave way to later groups whose material culture differed sharply. Whether these transitions reflect replacement, adaptation, or transformation remains uncertain. Yet the symbolic elements, the figurines carved with exaggerated features, the red ochre used in burials, the emphasis on fertility and continuity, feel like echoes from deeper traditions. These motifs reappear in disparate regions, from Siberia to the Mediterranean, suggesting that the Ice Age world was more interconnected, ideologically or symbolically, than the archaeological record alone can demonstrate. If these symbols once formed part of a widespread shared language of meaning, how much of that language was lost when populations splintered under climatic strain? What becomes increasingly evident is that the end of the Ice Age was not simply a physical transformation. It was a cultural and cognitive one as well. As landscapes shifted, so too did the frameworks through which humans understood their place in the world. Knowledge tied to particular ecosystems, whether the open steppes, the rich coastlines, or the inland wetlands, became obsolete as those ecosystems disappeared. New knowledge emerged, but not always from the same foundations. The break was not abrupt everywhere, yet the cumulative effect across continents was profound. A kind of global forgetting took place, not driven by negligence but by necessity, as communities rewove their identities to fit the new world that surrounded them. This gradual erosion of ancient traditions invites a final, unsettling reflection. If cultural memory is shaped by the land beneath our feet, then what happens when that land disappears entirely? How many times in the deep past did humanity undergo such erasures, such redefinitions of self and world? And if the traces we now uncover are only the faintest survivors of what once was, might there be entire chapters of human thought, belief, and connection still lying hidden beneath the ocean, waiting, perhaps eternally, for the world to shift once more. The dissolution of Ice Age worlds did not unfold evenly, nor did it sweep across humanity like a single, universal wave. In some regions, the retreat of glaciers opened corridors of abundance. In others, it sealed off once vital routes or drowned the plains that sustained early communities. And in this uneven transformation, we find one of the greatest enigmas of prehistory: the rise of cultural expressions that appeared fully formed, as though drawn from memories far older than the landscapes that now reveal them. The carvings, monuments, burial rites, and early technologies that surface in the archaeological record often feel less like beginnings than survivals. Fragments from a vanished cultural horizon that endured long enough to leave faint imprints on the world that followed. In the heart of the Eurasian steppe, for instance, the rediscovery of mammoth bone dwellings, some more than 20,000 years old, suggests levels of architectural planning rarely acknowledged in mainstream narratives. These circular structures, built from bones stacked and interlocked, were not haphazard shelters assembled in desperation. They show evidence of repeated construction, curated materials, and interior zoning for activities like storage, cooking, and tool making. Some even contain decorative elements carved into the bones themselves. Yet these settlements appear intermittently, suggesting that the knowledge required to build them did not spread universally. Was this because such knowledge was held by only a few groups? Or did environmental upheaval erase the pathways through which it might have diffused, leaving behind only isolated examples of what may once have been a broader tradition? Far to the south, on the Australian continent, rock art traditions extend into the deep reaches of the Ice Age. The Guion figures, delicate, elongated forms that appear to depict ceremonial attire, carry an elegance that suggests not merely artistic talent, but cultural depth. Interpreting them is difficult. The traditions attached to these figures were already ancient by the time later Aboriginal cultures formed their own narratives. Yet their persistence, even as other regions of Australia underwent ecological change, hints at lineages of memory that outlived their original contexts. Were these figures representations of rituals tied to vanished ecosystems, or echoes of ceremonies inherited from ancestors who crossed long-lost coastal plains, now buried beneath the Timor and Arafura seas? To the west, in the mountains of North Africa, the painted caves of the Libyan desert reveal scenes from a humid Sahara. Hunters pursuing giraffes, herders driving cattle, dancers moving in harmony with figures whose meaning has been lost to time. Some panels show individuals wearing elaborate garments, others engaging in apparent rituals. These images come from periods when the Sahara shifted repeatedly between desert and savanna, forcing communities to adapt, migrate, and reinvent their lives. If these artistic traditions persisted through such turbulence, they must reflect knowledge systems capable of surviving upheaval. Yet the silence of the intervening landscapes, the absence of settlements, shrines, or other sites that might link one artistic phase to another, suggests that vast chapters of cultural continuity have been buried beneath shifting dunes, erased almost as completely as the coasts erased by rising seas. Meanwhile, the regions bordering the Indian Ocean hold their own secrets. Off the western coast of India, in the Gulf of Kampat, sonar scans have revealed patterns on the seafloor that some researchers interpret as remnants of ancient structures. While the evidence remains contentious, the possibility itself raises an uncomfortable thought. If human settlements once lined these now submerged coasts, they may have been centers of trade and cultural exchange during the Ice Age, linking populations from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Such networks, if they existed, would have transmitted not only goods but ideas, concepts of ritual, technology, and social organization that later flourished in the agricultural civilizations of the Holocene. Yet with the drowning of those coasts, the archaeological record becomes a patchwork of disconnected points rather than the web of continuity it might once have represented. Even inland regions that escaped flooding carry signs of disruption. In Central Asia, the discovery of ancient cemeteries with carefully arranged burials, some adorned with beads, ochre, and tools, indicates long-standing ritual traditions. But these traditions appear and vanish with puzzling irregularity. DNA evidence suggests that populations moved through this region in waves, their cultural practices changing with the shifting climate. If some lineages carried memories of earlier rituals tied to different environments, those memories may have fractured as groups merged, separated, or adapted to new ecological pressures. What we see today in the archaeological record may therefore be only thin layers of a far deeper cultural sediment, compacted and distorted by time. This fragmentation becomes even more pronounced when we consider how myth may preserve what the earth no longer can. Stories of ancestral homelands lost to water appear in the traditions of indigenous Australians, the Andaman Islanders, and coastal peoples across the Pacific. While these myths cannot be treated as literal accounts, they may echo real events witnessed as sea levels rose by tens of meters within a few millennia. If oral traditions preserved memories of drowned landscapes for thousands of years, what other kinds of knowledge, navigation skills, medicinal practices, cosmologies, might have been carried forward in similarly veiled forms? And how much has been lost because it no longer served a place in the transformed world? As we sift through the scattered remnants of pre-Ice Age lifeways, piecing together fragments of art, architecture, ritual, and technology, a deeper realization settles like dusk across an ancient plain. The story we tell about the dawn of civilization may be less about beginnings and more about survivals. What remained after the world reshaped itself? What endured by chance rather than design? Yet this understanding brings forth its own question, gentle but persistent. If the roots of human culture lie in landscapes now lost, how much of our true origin continues to sleep beneath the sea, beyond the reach of our instruments, waiting for a moment when the earth's shifting tides reveal just one more forgotten shore? There is a quiet strangeness in the way certain symbols persist across impossible distances, as if carried not merely by migrating populations, but by a deeper, older current of shared memory that predated the world's reshaping. As the Ice Age drew toward its final centuries, different human groups, isolated by mountains, deserts, and glacial barriers, began to produce artistic and ritual expressions that echo one another in ways both subtle and profound. Spirals carved into stone, handprints pressed onto cave walls, geometric patterns etched into bone or ochre blocks. These motifs appear in Africa, Europe, Australia, and Asia, long before any known networks of long-distance cultural exchange. They suggest a symbolic unity that exceeds the small, practical needs of survival. And yet, as the world warmed and the seas rose, scattering communities into new configurations, these patterns fractured, their meanings dissolving into the diverse mythologies and cultural systems that emerged in the Holocene. In the caves of southern Africa, etched ochre pieces more than 70,000 years old bear cross-hatched geometric patterns whose precision implies deliberate intention. These markings, often dismissed as proto-art, demonstrate a capacity for abstraction that complicates any narrative of slow, linear cultural evolution. Meanwhile, on the distant island of Sulawesi, hand stencils and animal depictions of comparable antiquity reveal artistic traditions that appear to have arisen independently, unless, of course, they did not. If Ice Age populations shared cognitive frameworks shaped by environments far larger and more interconnected than the present world suggests, then the disappearance of those environments may have fragmented a symbolic system that once held global resonance. In Europe, the swirling motifs found in the caves of Lascaux and Pech Merle seem to resonate with patterns found much later in Neolithic megaliths and Bronze Age artifacts. Yet the lineage between these eras is tenuous, interrupted by climatic swings, population shifts, and the disappearance of intermediary sites. The Younger Dryas, an abrupt return to near-glacial conditions lasting more than a millennium, forced dramatic changes in settlement, resource use, and social structure. In such periods of upheaval, knowledge tied to ritual landscapes or seasonal cycles could have vanished or mutated, leaving behind only the faint echo of what once held unified meaning. How many symbolic traditions were lost not because their practitioners faded, but because the world that gave them purpose disappeared? Even more perplexing are the shared burial practices found across continents. Red ochre burials appear from Africa to Siberia to the Americas, spanning tens of thousands of years. Ochre, earth rich in iron oxide, seems to have held spiritual significance far beyond its practical uses. Yet the specific beliefs associated with it remain unknowable. Was it tied to blood, life force, protection, or transition between worlds? The recurrence is too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence, but too contextually scattered to map onto a single origin. It suggests that early humans, across vast spans of time and space, were part of a symbolic conversation that no longer survives in its original form. Far in the Arctic, ancient Siberian sites reveal burial mounds containing tools, beads, and ornaments that hint at social differentiation, even among small nomadic groups. These traditions appear again in early American cultures, whose ancestors crossed Beringia during the final Ice Age. Yet while the material similarities are evident, the meanings behind them have drifted, reshaped by the newly inhabited America's radically different landscapes. If the crossing into the New World represented a cultural as well as a biological migration, how much of the Ice Age worldview did these early travelers manage to carry with them? And how much was transformed or forgotten when their familiar northern plains gave way to mountains, forests, and grasslands unlike anything they had known? Beyond symbolic expression, practical knowledge may have suffered similar fractures. Navigation traditions, plant lore, and megafauna hunting strategies, skills honed through millennia of stability, became obsolete as coastlines vanished and animal populations collapsed. knowledge that once defined communities might have become burdensome memories in a world where survival required entirely new adaptations. In such times, cultural amnesia can be an act of necessity rather than loss. Yet traces of these old ways linger faintly. Some indigenous tales speak of giants, possibly memories of interactions with megafauna. Others describe the sea as a rising predator, slowly consuming ancestral lands. While these stories have evolved, their core images may reach back to the final tumultuous millennia of the Pleistocene. This interplay between endurance and disappearance creates an unsettling ambiguity. We can identify patterns, trace migrations, and analyze artifacts, yet the deeper coherence behind them remains elusive. What we perceive as disconnected regional traditions may instead be the scattered remains of a once expansive cultural horizon that existed before the world's coastlines drowned and its climates shifted beyond recognition. The thought lingers like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples into the dark. If fragments of a unified symbolic system still echo across continents, separated by oceans and millennia, what did the complete tapestry look like before the Ice Age erased the land that held it together? And if our modern understanding captures only its faintest outlines, how much more of humanity's shared past remains hidden in places we can no longer reach? Across the shifting edges of the ancient world, long before written language fixed memory into clay or stone, humans shaped their identities through movement. Movements across plains now drowned, across valleys now filled with forest, across deserts that were once green. These migrations, often portrayed as simple responses to hunger or climate, may have carried with them something far more intricate: the transmission of knowledge systems older than any surviving settlement, older than the landscapes themselves. But as the Ice Age neared its end, the corridors that once connected communities began to contract or vanish, leaving behind only the faintest traces of the intellectual worlds that once flowed along them. One of the most compelling of these lost corridors stretches across what is now the Sunda Shelf, an immense landmass that once linked the Malay Peninsula with Borneo, Java, and Sumatra. During the Pleistocene, this region formed a vast tropical expanse, teeming with rivers, marshlands, and open woodlands. Genetic studies suggest that early humans lived here in large, interconnected populations, maintaining contact across distances that today would require long sea voyages. If ideas, rituals, and technologies moved freely across this ancient landscape, then the symbolic traditions preserved in the caves of Borneo, Sulawesi, and the Philippines may represent the last visible remnants of a far broader cultural tapestry. Yet when sea levels rose more than 100 meters, submerging the shelf, entire worlds of memory disappeared in silence. How many stories, carved onto wooden totems or painted on vanished cliff faces, lie now beneath the South China Sea? And how different might our understanding of early human creativity be if those lost canvases had survived? To the north, in the cold expanse of Siberia, another forgotten world took shape as bands of humans navigated the frozen plains that stretched unbroken into the far reaches of Beringia. Here, far from the cave art of Europe and the tropical imagery of Southeast Asia, people developed tool systems marked by precision and adaptability. Some sites reveal intricate projectile points crafted using advanced pressure flaking techniques, methods requiring fine motor skills, patience, and deep knowledge passed across generations. These traditions may have originated in even older cultures whose archaeological traces have been destroyed by glacial movement or submerged during the warming periods. As rising seas inundated Beringia, the cultural continuity that once spanned continents became compressed into isolated pockets. The early peoples crossing into the Americas carried only fragments of these ancient traditions, reshaping them in landscapes where megafauna, climate, and geography differed profoundly. The result is a cultural dissonance, echoes without source, motifs without context, that complicates our interpretation of the first American societies. How much of their worldview was inherited from vanished ancestors of the northern plains, and how much was reinvented in the wild, unfamiliar environments they encountered. In the Mediterranean basin, too, the Ice Age left shadows on the landscape. Before the sea reclaimed vast areas of land, the basin's coastlines were far broader, dotted with estuaries, marshes, and sheltered coves. These were ideal environments for early human communities that relied on fishing, shell gathering, plant harvesting, and small game hunting. Evidence from submerged sites near modern-day Israel, Italy, and the Adriatic coast suggests the presence of settlements that thrived before the post-glacial floods erased them. Stone tools, hearth remains, and even traces of ancient structures discovered underwater hint at lifeways more complex than the sparse inland record suggests. If these communities had developed maritime knowledge, currents, tides, seasonal fish migrations, such expertise would have been vital yet fragile, disappearing when coastlines were swallowed. Today, only scattered artifacts remain to suggest the richness of those coastal societies. What languages were spoken along those drowned shores? What myths shaped their perception of the tides that eventually consumed their homes? Even in places untouched by rising seas, cultural erasure occurred through subtler means. As ice sheets retreated across northern Europe, enormous glacial lakes burst free, reshaping rivers and blanketing valleys in torrents of water that obliterated everything in their path. Settlements, hunting camps, and ritual sites would have been swept away with no trace. Archaeologists occasionally find a solitary tool or bone fragment in these regions, isolated from its cultural context, like a note torn from a book whose remaining pages have been burned. Such remnants evoke more questions than answers. Were these places temporary encampments or parts of larger ritual landscapes? Did communities gather at certain times of year to exchange goods or knowledge? And what ideas might have circulated among them? Ideas that left no material signature, yet shaped generations before fading into silence. Patterns emerge in burials as well. Across Eurasia, graves dating to the end of the Ice Age show increasing variability. Some individuals were adorned with beads, ochre, and antler artifacts, while others were interred with little ceremony. This shift may reflect social stress, cultural divergence, or the collapse of older ritual frameworks tied to disappearing environments. The symbolic unity once observed across regions becomes fragmented. What if these divergences mark not the rise of complexity, as often assumed, but the fading of an earlier coherence, one that bound distant groups through shared cosmology and ritual, now disrupted by ecological turmoil? The more we trace these scattered threads, the more the true scale of the Ice Age's cultural dissolution becomes apparent. It was not a single loss, but a cascade, different in each region, yet linked by the same inexorable forces of climate and geography. Some knowledge persisted, transformed by new landscapes. Other knowledge evaporated, leaving only cryptic hints in myths, artifacts, or stylistic echoes. And in the quiet space created by these absences, one final question stirs. If entire symbolic worlds could fade with the melting of ice and the rise of seas, how much of humanity's earliest intellectual landscape lies not in what we have found, but in the vast territories where we have not yet thought to look? Across the margins of what would one day become the familiar world, the final centuries of the Ice Age brought a slow but inexorable pressure, one that pushed human communities toward thresholds where older ways of understanding could no longer fully hold. And it is precisely at these thresholds that the archaeological record begins to show a strange duality. The emergence of new cultural patterns alongside inexplicable remnants of something older, as though people carried half-remembered traditions from landscapes that no longer existed. These patterns appear in rituals, in technologies, and in the organization of early settlements, forming a patchwork whose edges never quite align. It is this disjunction, this quiet misalignment between what survived and what vanished, that hints at how profoundly the melting world reshaped human memory. On the plains that once stretched across what is now the North Sea, the region known to archaeologists as Doggerland, hunter-gatherer communities flourished for thousands of years. Radiocarbon dating of submerged peat layers reveals traces of human activity, tool fragments, butchered animal bones, even worked wood. Some of these pieces show refined craftsmanship comparable to contemporary inland cultures. Yet what makes Doggerland unusual is not merely its size or richness, but the possibility that it served as a cultural bridge connecting populations in Britain, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. If knowledge flowed through this region, ideas about hunting, ritual, or social bonds, then its drowning around 8,200 years ago represents not just geological loss, but the obliteration of a cultural heartland. When Doggerland vanished beneath the rising waters of the North Atlantic, how many inherited traditions drowned with it? And what survived only because individuals carried fragments inland, stripped of their original context, reshaped to fit new environments. In the highlands of Anatolia, a different kind of mystery unfolds. Long before the rise of agriculture, communities gathered at sites marked by circular enclosures, carved stones, and animal reliefs. Göbekli Tepe, the most famous of these, is often seen as an anomaly, a sudden flowering of symbolic architecture. But nearby sites such as Karahan Tepe and Sefer Tepe suggest a broader, interconnected ritual landscape. The craftsmanship of these pillars, their standardized forms, and their consistent iconographic themes imply a shared cosmology that may have roots deeper than the surviving structures reveal. It is possible that this ritual tradition was not a beginning, but a culmination, the final chapter of a belief system shaped across generations by groups living along the now submerged coasts of the eastern Mediterranean. If so, then Göbekli Tepe might represent not the birth of ritual architecture, but its last luminous expression before the world changed irrevocably. Farther east, in what is now the Gobi Desert, evidence of early symbolic behavior emerges from places where water once flowed freely. Sites containing beads made from ostrich eggshell, items requiring delicate craftsmanship, have been found alongside hearths and stone tools dating back nearly 40,000 years. Such beads often served as markers of identity, signaling group affiliation or social status. Their widespread distribution across Central and East Asia hints at networks of interaction far more complex than the desolate modern landscape suggests. Yet as the region dried over millennia, these networks must have fragmented. The beads remain tiny and beautiful, but the social worlds that gave them meaning dissolved into dust. Was there once a vibrant cultural corridor stretching from Central Asia to the Pacific, its memory now reduced to scattered ornaments and faint stylistic parallels? In the Americas, too, threads of ancient continuity appear and disappear. The rock shelters of Brazil's Serra da Capivara contain paintings that some researchers argue are tens of thousands of years old, depictions of dances, ceremonies, and hunts. If these dates hold true, they suggest symbolic traditions that either arose independently or were carried by some of the earliest migrants to the continent. Yet the cultural connections between these early South American painters and the populations who later shaped the Amazon's intricate agro-ecological systems remain difficult to trace. The archaeological record between the Ice Age and the Holocene is marked by discontinuities, sites abandoned, regions depopulated, styles shifting abruptly. These gaps are reminders that the ancient Americas, like the rest of the world, experienced waves of forgetting and renewal tied to environmental change. Even the great river systems of Africa, which acted as lifelines for human evolution, hold secrets of lost cultural lineages. Along the banks of the Nile and the now vanished tributaries of the Sahara, archaeologists find stone tools that resemble earlier traditions from regions now underwater. Burial sites adorned with beads, ochre, and carved artifacts suggest long-standing ritual continuity. Yet the symbolic vocabulary shifts dramatically with time. As the Sahara dried after 8,000 BCE, communities were forced to migrate toward more fertile lands. In this movement, older traditions may have fractured, becoming absorbed into new cultural identities that emerged from necessity rather than choice. What becomes increasingly clear is that the end of the Ice Age did not mark the dawn of civilization, but the partial eclipse of something older. It was a period when landscapes that had shaped humanity for tens of thousands of years vanished or transformed, forcing people to reinterpret the world and renegotiate their relationship with the past. Rituals tied to certain rivers, mountains, or coastlines lost their meaning when those places disappeared. Technologies suited to particular environments became obsolete. Stories encoded in myth may have survived, but in altered form, their original contexts erased. And in the open space where these forgotten worlds once stood, one more quiet uncertainty arises, soft but insistent. If so much of human culture was tied to landscapes now lost, how incomplete is the story we tell ourselves today? And what deeper chapters remain hidden in places the sea reclaimed long before we learned to write? Across the eroded boundaries of early human history, there are moments when the archaeological record seems to hesitate, as though standing at the threshold between two eras, one shaped by ancestral memory, the other by the shifting realities of a warming world. It is within this hesitation that some of the strangest clues appear. faint yet persistent, like the last glimmers of a lantern fading in the distance. These clues do not announce themselves as grand discoveries or definitive proofs. Instead, they whisper of transitions, rituals that grew unfamiliar even to those who practiced them, settlements that retained the shape of older lifeways while adapting to new environments, tools whose design hints at forgotten predecessors. And in their quiet presence, they suggest that the end of the Ice Age was not merely a transformation of climate, but a profound reorganization of human meaning. Along the shores of ancient Lake Victoria, evidence of early communities shows patterns that feel both familiar and strangely divergent. Stone tools found in this region exhibit traits reminiscent of older East African industries, yet they also carry innovations that seem to arise abruptly. The people who lived here moved between lake-rich environments that supported fishing, gathering, and seasonal mobility. Such lifeways required acute ecological knowledge, patterns of fish migration, plant cycles, and shoreline shifts that cannot be reconstructed solely from artifacts. If these communities inherited older traditions from populations once living along coastlines, now submerged beneath the Indian Ocean, what portions of that inherited knowledge endured in these inland refuges? And equally, what portions slipped away when the old shorelines vanished, replaced by lakes whose rhythms told entirely different stories? To the north, the Nile Valley offers another kind of enigma. Before the emergence of pharaonic civilization, before monumental stone temples and elaborate funerary rites, the region was home to groups who practiced burial customs both intimate and symbolically sophisticated. Graves dating back more than 15,000 years contain bodies carefully positioned, often dusted with ochre, sometimes accompanied by personal ornaments or tools. Some of these early burials bear resemblance to traditions found as far away as Central Asia, while others align more closely with practices in the Levant. It creates a mosaic that feels less like isolated invention and more like converging echoes of older symbolic frameworks, carried inland as coastal populations shifted. Yet because the land between these regions has transformed so dramatically, rivers rerouted, forests replaced by desert, much of the connective tissue remains invisible, erased by time and environment. On the far edges of Eurasia, the Japanese archipelago holds another fragmentary story. During the late Pleistocene, lower sea levels connected the islands to the continent, allowing human groups to disperse freely across mountains, coasts, and inland valleys. The Jomon culture, emerging long after the Ice Age, is celebrated for its intricate pottery, some of the oldest in the world. But earlier traces hint at continuity rooted in pre-Holocene symbolic traditions. The style of some early Jomon vessels, with their cord-marked surfaces and swirling motifs, may draw inspiration from natural patterns or older forms no longer preserved. If so, then the pottery does not represent an abrupt flowering, but the resurfacing of symbolic impulses nurtured across generations. Yet when sea levels rose and the islands became isolated, whatever shared traditions once linked them to mainland populations became fragmented, leaving the archipelago to develop its own distinctive cultural trajectory. What exchanges, ritual, technological, or mythological, were lost when the land bridge sank beneath the Pacific, turning collective memory into regional divergence? Similarly, along the western fringes of the Americas, early coastal societies crafted tools and ornaments from materials like abalone shell, bone, and finely worked stone. These communities, navigating rich marine environments, depended on knowledge of tides, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles. Their traditions, now difficult to trace because later sea level rise inundated their settlements, may have carried fragments of Ice Age maritime lore originating in the northern Pacific. If so, then the disappearance of their coastal plains represents not merely a loss of archaeological data, but the erasure of entire intellectual lineages. The shell beads and fishing implements found on higher ground appear as isolated artifacts, yet they may have once belonged to broader systems of meaning that integrated cosmology with coastal ecology. Without the drowned settlements that once held these traditions, their deeper significance remains beyond our reach. Further south, in the Andean highlands, early sites reveal a different kind of legacy, one tied to altitude rather than coastlines. As humans migrated into these mountains, they encountered ecosystems unlike anything in their ancestral homelands. Yet even here, certain symbolic elements persisted. The use of pigments, the placement of stones in ritual contexts, the construction of shelters that reflect intentional alignment with landscape features. These continuities suggest that the Andean newcomers brought with them concepts rooted in older traditions, perhaps cosmologies tied to celestial observation or to the relationship between earth and sky. Over time, these concepts fused with the highland environment, evolving into the complex ritual systems that would eventually characterize Andean civilizations. But what of the original forms, those earliest symbolic structures that predated the mountains and may have belonged to worlds now erased by rising seas or shifting plains? Across all these regions, the same quiet pattern repeats. Traditions appear to endure, yet their origins remain obscured. Innovations arise, yet they seem to carry the residue of older knowledge. It is as if humanity passed through a threshold where memory was both preserved and severed, where some threads anchored themselves to new landscapes while others drifted into oblivion. And within this fragile balance between endurance and loss, a single question unfolds, soft as dust settling after a long migration. If the last glacial centuries shaped not just where humans lived, but what they could remember, then how many ancestral worlds, entire constellations of thought, ritual, and meaning lie just beyond the edge of what the surviving evidence allows us to see? Across the fading horizons of the late Pleistocene, as the world edged uneasily toward its warmer future, certain sites begin to emerge with a peculiar resonance. Places where the traces of human presence seem to gesture toward patterns older than their material remains suggest. These sites do not offer the solidity of later monuments, nor the overt narrative of written records. Instead, they give us hints, arrangements of stones whose purposes are obscured, layers of habitation that seem to rise and collapse with each climatic shift, and ritual objects whose designs echo motifs found thousands of kilometers away. And in these echoes, we sense a paradox, evidence that humans carried deep traditions forward, even as the landscapes that once sustained those traditions dissolved beneath ice, flood, or sand. It is in these disjointed fragments that one begins to glimpse the outline of a cultural world that did not survive the transition into the Holocene, though faint imprints of it remain. Along the western Ghats of India, rock shelters reveal paintings and engravings whose geometric motifs evoke comparisons with symbolic traditions in Africa and Southeast Asia. Although separated by millennia and vast distances, the repeated use of nested patterns, spirals, and cross-hatchings whispers of a symbolic continuity difficult to explain through isolated development alone. Some researchers propose that these designs reflect universal cognitive tendencies, human minds grappling with perception and memory. Yet another possibility lies just beyond the reach of certainty: that these motifs represent a fractured inheritance, a fading memory of shared traditions once spread across the now submerged coasts of the Indian Ocean basin. If ancient populations moved freely along those lost shores, exchanging not just goods but cosmological ideas, then these paintings may be their last distorted reflections. But without the coastal settlements that once linked the continents, these echoes remain unanchored, drifting in the archaeological record like stray threads from a tapestry long unraveled. Across the Arabian Peninsula, enigmatic stone structures known as kites, mustatils, and meandering stone lines stretch across barren landscapes that were once fertile. Some of these constructions date back more than 7,000 years, yet their roots likely reach deeper into the pre-Holocene. The mustatils, in particular, elongated rectangular enclosures, appear in astonishing numbers, often positioned with deliberate orientation. While their exact purpose remains unclear, their sheer scale suggests communal effort and shared ritual intention. Could these structures be descendants of earlier ceremonial architectures that once stood along the drowned coasts of the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf? The Gulf itself was a fertile river valley during the Ice Age, home to ecosystems that would have supported human societies whose settlements vanished beneath the rising waters. If mustatils represent the surviving memory of rituals practiced in that vanished valley, then their presence in the desert becomes not an anomaly, but a quiet memorial to a world swallowed by the sea. Farther north, in the Caucasus foothills, early farming communities exhibit cultural traits that seem disproportionately mature for their time. Their houses were built with standardized plans, their tools finely worked, their burial practices marked by a complexity that speaks of long-standing symbolic systems. Yet the speed with which these settlements appear suggests that their cultural sophistication was not invented anew, but transplanted from older traditions. It raises the possibility that the first agricultural societies did not arise in isolation, but carried forward ritual frameworks inherited from pre-agricultural ancestors whose own histories stretch back to landscapes now lost. If so, then the origins of agriculture are inseparable from Ice Age memory, shaped not only by environmental opportunity, but by cultural continuity that endured despite the erasure of its original context. In the depths of the Amazon, enigmatic earthworks, geometric enclosures, long, straight ditches, and carefully sculpted mounds testify to ancient order in a place long assumed untamed. While many date to the late Holocene, their underlying patterns hint at older principles: persistent attention to cardinal directions, repeated use of circular and square forms, and the strategic placement of structures along waterways. These principles may reflect cognitive habits much older than the forest settlements themselves. If early migrants to South America carried pre-Ice Age cosmologies, encoded in spatial arrangements, ritual geometry, and ecological perception, then the earthworks might represent the last faint resonance of beliefs brought across Beringia and reshaped by millennia of adaptation. But the deeper origins remain invisible, hidden behind the vanishing landscapes of the north. Even the earliest musical instruments provide clues to worlds we cannot quite reconstruct. Bone flutes from Europe, dating more than 40,000 years old, share tonal capabilities similar to later instruments from Central Asia and even Oceania. While convergent invention is possible, the emotional and symbolic importance of music suggests deeper continuity. Songs carried through migration can outlive the places where they were first sung. Yet with no written notation, the melodies themselves vanished, leaving only the hollow bones that once shaped them. These instruments, so delicate yet enduring, remind us that certain layers of Ice Age culture, those tied to sound, rhythm, myth, and oral recitation, are irretrievably lost, even if their emotional echoes linger in later human traditions. What becomes haunting is the realization that much of what we interpret as innovation may instead be survival, fragments of older systems adapted to new climates, stripped of their original meaning, reshaped by necessity. The transition from Ice Age to Holocene was not a clean break, but a fracturing. Some traditions crossed the threshold intact, others splintered, diverging into entirely new forms. Still others were swallowed whole, leaving only faint, unrecognizable traces in archaeology, myth, or ritual. And in that fracture lies a final, lingering uncertainty. If the continuity between these scattered cultural fragments is real, if they are the surviving outposts of a vast pre-Ice Age worldview, then how completely has the rising world hidden the roots of our earliest identity? And if the sea were to recede someday, what stories might emerge from the depths, challenging the narratives we have built upon the thin soil of what little remains? Across the margins of the world that emerged from the Ice Age's dissolving grip, there lies a growing awareness that many traditions we associate with the dawn of civilization may not represent beginnings at all, but reconfigurations, echoes of older frameworks adapted to environments that no longer resembled the ancestral landscapes from which they sprang. As the Holocene settled in, warming the continents and filling the oceans, people reorganized their lives around new ecological realities. Yet amid this reorganization, certain elements of symbolic behavior persisted in ways that feel almost defiant, as though they carried memories older than the newly transformed world could contain. It is within these persistent and yet strangely displaced traditions that we find some of the most compelling suggestions of cultural continuity, reaching back beyond the end of the Ice Age. In the highlands of the Levant, for example, early agricultural communities constructed circular stone structures whose functions remain debated: granaries, shrines, meet-in places. But their shapes echo architectural forms seen in much earlier hunter-gatherer contexts. Long before cultivation, people in this region built circular shelters, arranged hearths in precise locations, and gathered for rituals involving feasting and the sharing of food. The continuity of circular design, especially in communal spaces, suggests not a sudden reinvention, but a lingering attachment to architectural patterns tied to social rituals predating the sedentary life. It raises the possibility that the transition to agriculture did not erase the older symbolic frameworks, but instead anchored them in increasingly permanent structures. Yet the deeper origins of those frameworks, developed along ancient coasts or river valleys since lost, remain obscured, leaving only the visible continuity, not the landscape that once gave it meaning. On the steppes surrounding the Caspian Sea, early Holocene communities left behind burial mounds, whose forms hint at rituals older than their material traces suggest. Some mounds contain individuals adorned with beads, animal parts, or carved objects that mirror practices observed in Ice Age Eurasia. The deliberate alignment of certain graves with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, or star paths implies a continuity of sky-oriented ritual traditions. But the precise logic underpinning these alignments is difficult to decipher because the night sky itself has shifted subtly over tens of thousands of years. The constellations these people observed may have differed from those recognized in later agrarian cultures. If so, then these mounds may represent late survivors of a star-based worldview that originated in landscapes now underwater or buried beneath glacial sediments. The mounds are thus both presence and absence, material reminders of a cosmology whose original shape we can no longer fully reconstruct. In the northern forests of Europe, the Mesolithic communities that followed the Ice Age carried stone, bone, and antler working traditions remarkably similar to their late Pleistocene predecessors. Some of their artifacts, harpoons, fishhooks, decorative carvings, suggest a near seamless continuity from earlier coastal cultures that once lived along the shores of the North Atlantic's vast lower sea level coastline. But when that coastline drowned, the symbolic and practical systems tied to maritime life had to be reshaped for inland rivers, lakes, and forests. What remains in the record, therefore, is an adaptive hybrid. Tools refined from older maritime traditions, yet recontextualized for a very different world. In this sense, the Mesolithic represents neither a middle period nor a transition born of emptiness, but a bridge, one whose pillars are anchored in submerged cultural foundations. Farther east, a similar pattern appears in Siberia, where ritual sites show the continued use of animal symbolism long after megafauna had vanished. Carved figurines of mammoths, bears, and birds persist in regions where these species were no longer central to daily subsistence. Such persistence suggests not nostalgia, but symbolic inertia, traditions whose roots may lie in Ice Age mythologies, tied to landscapes and ecosystems now lost. If these figurines represented spirits, ancestors, or cosmic beings, their significance may have shifted as the world changed, but the forms remained. They are relics of belief systems that did not fade simply because the animals they once honored grew scarce, and in their quiet endurance, they hint at how deeply humans sought continuity amid environmental upheaval, clinging to symbols even as their original meanings dissolved. In Southeast Asia, the earliest evidence of agricultural experimentation overlaps with lingering forager traditions that used stone tools of designs remarkably old. Some scholars view this as technological conservatism, but another interpretation is possible: that these tools reflect the persistence of knowledge systems formed in pre-Ice Age coastal environments. The rising seas submerged the fertile plains where early experimentation with plant management may have begun, forcing groups into more marginal regions where agriculture took new, regionally distinct forms. If this is true, then the domestication of rice and other crops may represent not innovation, but adaptation, an attempt to re-establish a way of life once tied to drowned landscapes. The archaeological record captures only the survivors of this process, not the pathways erased by seawater. Across the Pacific from Polynesia to South America, mythic traditions speak of primordial lands swallowed by waves or of ancestors who traveled across vast plains now hidden beneath the ocean. While such stories cannot be taken literally, their symbolic structure echoes real events associated with late Pleistocene sea level rise. If these myths preserve distorted memories of ancient landscapes, then they may be the last intangible thread linking modern populations to the Ice Age world their distant ancestors inhabited. But without material evidence, these narratives hover between memory and metaphor, leaving open the question of what they once described in precise cultural terms. What becomes increasingly evident is that the early Holocene did not mark a clean beginning, but a palimpsest, new ways of life inscribed over older ones partially erased by time, climate, and loss of context. The continuity visible in tools, symbols, architecture, and ritual reveals that early humans did not start anew after the Ice Age. They carried their past with them, even as much of that past lay buried beneath the rising seas or transformed landscapes. And in that fragile continuity, its edges blurred by environmental change, its center hollowed by the loss of ancestral homelands, one more quiet question takes shape. If the early Holocene world still bore the fading imprint of civilizations or cultural networks older than we can now trace, then how much deeper must we look to find the true foundations of humanity's shared story? Across the final threshold between the Ice Age world and the one that would eventually cradle the first written civilizations, humanity stood in a space defined as much by absence as by endurance. Landscapes had shifted, coastlines had drowned, and entire ecological systems that once sustained human communities had vanished. Yet in the archaeological record of the early Holocene, there is a subtle tension, an impression that humanity did not emerge into this new age unanchored, but instead tethered to vestiges of deeper traditions whose origins remain out of reach. It is this tension, this interplay between visible innovation and invisible inheritance, that shapes the last glimmers of the pre-Ice Age horizon. And as we follow these fragments into the beginnings of recorded history, we find that certain patterns persist with an almost spectral consistency. As if guided by memories carried across a threshold the earth itself no longer remembers. In the fertile arc of the Near East, the rise of settled villages and early agriculture is often framed as a sudden leap forward, a revolutionary shift from foraging to farming. Yet when we examine the earliest known settlements, such as Jerf el Ahmar, Tsayonu, or the pre-pottery layers of Jericho, we find architectural and ritual structures that seem far too symbolically mature to belong to true beginnings. Circular communal buildings, stone foundations aligned with specific axes, and ritual deposits of skulls and animal remains point to belief systems already fully articulated. The skull cults of the Levant, for instance, where human crania were removed, plastered, or arranged in ceremonial contexts, do not feel like experiments. They feel like the continuation of practices rooted in much older symbolic frameworks, perhaps tied to ancestral landscapes now erased. If these rites originated in Ice Age traditions practiced along coasts or plateaus long since reshaped, then what we see in these early Holocene villages are not inaugural acts, but late expressions of rituals already heavy with meaning. The same pattern emerges thousands of kilometers away, along the ancient floodplains of the Yellow River in China. The earliest settlements show signs of coordinated labor, communal granaries, and ritual pits filled with carefully arranged artifacts or animal remains. Some contain carvings that resemble later Chinese cosmological symbols, yet they exist millennia before such cosmologies entered written form. Their presence in these early contexts suggests the possibility of even older intellectual lineages, conceptual structures passed through generations, carried through migrations, and reassembled in new landscapes after earlier habitats were lost. If these symbols point to a cosmology inherited from Ice Age ancestors who once traversed the wide plains of East Asia or the now drowned shores of the East China Sea, then they echo the persistence of a worldview that adapted even as the land beneath it disappeared. In the Americas, the emergence of early mound-building traditions offers another puzzle. Sites like Watson Brake in North America, predating the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years, exhibit architectural planning and social organization that seem disproportionate to the scale of the societies that built them. The mounds form circular or elliptical arrangements, often aligned with astronomical patterns. Their builders were foragers, not farmers, yet their constructions reflect a ritual geometry found later in more complex societies. These alignments may be inheritors of sky-based observational traditions carried by ancestors who had crossed from Siberia long before, traditions shaped by the way Ice Age peoples understood the heavens. If so, then the mounds represent not an anomalous early achievement, but the recontextualization of beliefs brought from a world whose ecological rhythms no longer existed in the Americas. The stars remained the same, but the landscapes beneath them had changed. And with that change, the meanings encoded in those alignments began to drift, taking on new forms. Far to the south, the earliest Andean societies built platforms, arranged stones, and shaped ritual spaces that appear startlingly similar to those found later at monumental sites like Corral or Chavin. Yet these early structures arise in a context where agriculture was still unstable and populations remained small. Their architectural sophistication suggests that the principles guiding them were not inventions of the moment, but part of an inherited symbolic grammar, one with deeper roots, perhaps carried by ancestors who migrated through the Andean foothills during the transitional centuries of the late Pleistocene. If these rituals and architectural forms originated in Ice Age traditions tied to now lost river valleys or glacial basins, then the Andes may preserve one of the last living shadows of a worldview whose original form is no longer accessible to us. Even the earliest evidence of social stratification, elite burials, ornamental objects, and differentiated grave goods carries this ambiguity. In regions from the Danube Basin to the African Great Lakes, early Holocene burials show distinctions that imply roles, statuses, or lineages encoded in symbolic systems older than the communities practicing them. Beads made from distant materials, pigments applied in patterns, and tools placed with ritual intent suggest that social identity was shaped not merely by immediate circumstances, but by traditions whose origins may lie far deeper in the past than the archaeological context reveals. If social hierarchies emerged from Ice Age ritual frameworks rooted in ancestry, cosmology, or ecological specialization, then the earliest chiefs, shamans, or elites were not the first of their kind, but the last inheritors of roles that evolved across tens of millennia. What becomes haunting as we approach the end of this long arc is the realization that when history finally becomes visible, when writing appears, when monuments rise, when recorded myth gives shape to memory, it does so atop a world already shaped by layers of forgetting. The civilizations that left written chronicles inherited only the surviving strands of traditions that had already passed through profound ruptures. The true beginnings had drowned, eroded, or dissolved in silence. And so, as we stand at the edge of recorded history, one lingering question emerges like a distant echo carried across the water. If the Ice Age world shaped the foundations upon which civilization later stood, then what deeper inheritance, unknown, unseen, unspoken, still lies beneath the stories we tell about our origins, waiting for the rare convergence of discovery and imagination to bring its forgotten contours back into the light? As the long arc of this quiet exploration draws to its close, the landscapes we have revisited, those drowned beneath rising seas, buried under shifting sands, or erased by forests that reclaimed the plains, continue to shimmer at the edge of understanding. The pre-Ice Age world refuses to offer a complete story. Its remnants arrive fractured, its evidence scattered, its voices almost entirely swallowed by time. And yet, in every tool smoothed by ancient hands, in every ochre-marked burial, in every geometric pattern echoing across far-flung continents, there lingers the same suggestion, that humanity's origins are woven from threads far older, more intricate, and more interconnected than our surviving histories can fully reveal. The civilizations we know, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus, the Yellow River kingdoms, stand not at the beginning, but at the threshold where memory finally became architecture, narrative, and law. Beneath their foundations, like bedrock worn by forgotten tides, lie the faint imprints of Ice Age cultures whose names we may never learn, whose stories survive only in shadows. A ritual form repeated across millennia, a symbol carved with no known precedent, the alignment of stones that mirrors a sky long since shifted. These are the quiet inheritances of a world that vanished before the first temple rose. Perhaps the most humbling truth is not what we have uncovered, but what remains beyond reach. The ocean floor may cradle entire chapters of human history, settlements where myth began, harbors where early navigators read the stars, gathering sites where rituals tied communities together long before writing preserved their meaning. We live atop the ruins of landscapes that shaped our becoming, yet we rarely sense the weight of those unseen worlds beneath our feet. And so this journey closes not with certainty, but with awareness. The Ice Age did not end simply by yielding to warmth. It ended by reshaping memory itself, by severing pathways, drowning homelands, and scattering traditions into fragments that later civilizations wove into disparate myths. To contemplate what humanity lost is to listen to the silence between those fragments, to sense the presence of knowledge that slipped beyond recovery, and to acknowledge that our story extends deeper into the past than the visible record allows. If these reflections have stirred your curiosity, if they have drawn you towards the vastness of what once was and what may yet be uncovered, then the path forward remains open. The ancient world does not end at the edges of what we know. It continues in each unanswered question, in each artifact lifted from the silt, in each myth that hints at something older than itself. Thank you for drifting with me through these submerged horizons, for allowing your imagination to wander where evidence grows thin and mystery thickens. This is the realm where discovery begins, not in the certainty of conclusions, but in the willingness to seek what lies beyond them. You are always welcome here, in the Cryptic Realm channel, where the past is never as silent as it seems, and where every forgotten shore invites us to listen a little more closely before we sleep.